Hello, and welcome back to part 2 of building a Tango Skiff 14. I would like to start by addressing a mistake in the first video. The sponsons won't be installed until the third video, so subscribe and you won't miss it. We started by sanding the fillets to prepare them for fiberglass taping. We used a random orbit sander for the large areas, and a single piece of sandpaper to get into all of the nooks and crannies. After the fillets were all smooth, I started applying fiberglass tape. This is strips of fiberglass adhered with epoxy. The fiberglass tape, combined with the fillets, provides the strength in the joints. All of the joints on my boat utilize this method of fiberglass tape and epoxy for strength. The first thing I did was to cut out the strips of tape to roughly the correct size so I wasn't fussing with a whole roll of tape. The way I applied the epoxy to the joints was simple, placing down epoxy in the corner of the joints with a paintbrush, then laying the fiberglass tape. After I had placed the tape and got it roughly into position, I went along the tape with a paintbrush and wetted the entire strip. Wetting is the process of soaking epoxy through the fiberglass tape. I started with the back bulkheads before me and my dad started working on the center of the boat. The 6-inch tape was extremely hard to get to lay flat around the curves, which is why we were only using it down the center of the boat that has a very gentle curve. All of the joints in the rear bulkhead boxes have fiberglass tape, which makes them very strong and helps to transfer the loads from the transom into the rest of the boat. All of the imperfections and globs of fillet left behind showed in the tape, leaving little air bubbles where the tape couldn't sit properly, which is why it was important to be careful filleting and sanding. For those of you who don't know what filleting is, I have a link explaining it in my last video, but basically it is making the joints rounded. All of the fiberglass tape came in rolls, which I will leave links to in the description. Next, I continue fiberglass taping the forward bulkhead. This is where 4 pieces of plywood meet, and it was very tricky meshing all of the tape. Overall, it was very challenging to get the tape to lay correctly and not buckle. The tape liked to fold over itself and get wrinkled, especially in the corners. The solution to these imperfections was usually more epoxy and smoothing, with a gloved hand as opposed to a paintbrush. It was also challenging to keep the tape in place, because if you weren't careful with the brush, you could push and move the tape out of place. The tape goes from white to almost clear once the epoxy is soaked through, and that is usually the indication I used for telling if the tape was wetted. After finishing the forward bulkhead, I move on to the middle section. I used 2-inch wide tape for most of the joints while using 6-inch tape for the center line. I also covered both of the scarf joints with fiberglass tape for extra strength on the bottom of the boat. This was not in the plans, but I figured it would make the boat even stronger. When the tape got wrinkled and formed creases, this was a problem because it's not a flat surface, and I would have to sand some of the material off, which removed some of the strength, and it was also a lot of work. I was using the slow cure epoxy because the epoxy had to sit in the cup for a long time because this process was so tedious. All of the bulkhead and joints in the back section of the boat got fiberglass as well. A lot of these joints get covered by other pieces of wood, so you never see the hard work, but now you know it is there. And all of the joints that don't get covered have a layer of paint and primer to protect them from the UV because epoxy, the glue, deteriorates in the light of the sun. I enlisted the help of one of my friends to speed up the process, and it was fun teaching another person how to fiberglass tape on my boat. At the ends of the pieces of wood, I tried to leave the tape standing straight up from the wood. I found this was the easiest way to clean them up afterwards, because I could use a razor to cut most of it off and just sand down the rest. I had some extra epoxy, so I started covering the insides with epoxy. This is how all of the wood on my boat is sealed from water. My goal was 2 coats of epoxy over all of the wood on the inside, and that is what I did. For the most part, I used a paintbrush and cup to spread the epoxy. This boat is mainly going in fresh water, so it is extra important to seal the wood. This is because salt water will almost pickle the wood and it does not rot as fast. However, fresh water just rots the wood. And I suppose I should talk about the piece of wood spanning the boat. We put this in place after installing the bulkheads, and its purpose is to hold the boat at the correct beam. The beam is the width of the boat at the widest point of the boat, and the wood is needed to help hold the boat's shape before we get the seats installed and the boat's shape secured. After the first coat of epoxy and all of the tape is laid down, I sanded the entire boat. This is because you need to sand epoxy after a cure so that the next layer sticks down well. The top layer of epoxy can dry so smooth that it's hard for the next layer to grab onto. So by sanding it, I'm creating scratches that allow the next layer a place to hold on. For the second coat, I used a roller and tray. This was because I was doing the whole thing in one shot and needed to cover a large area. A large amount of epoxy gets soaked into the roller, so if you're doing a small area, it is very wasteful. All of the bulkheads, bottoms, side panels, and floorboards got covered with their second coat of epoxy. the floorboards that I'm just now cutting out. Not all of the videos are quite in chronological order. I try to show creating the piece of wood right before it is attached to the boat. However, I do not want to show any of the video clips more than once. I cut out the front floorboard and one of the motor mounts that I did not end up using from one of the sheets of rough cut plywood. This floorboard is angled to fit in the front of the boat. Next, I cut out the rear floorboard. Although this floorboard is mostly covered by the center console, it still provides a nice place to stand up in the back of the boat. There is a large hole in the rear floorboard for all of the wires and cables to go from the center console to the motor. Both of these floorboards are epoxied and filleted in place. I used the weights of some of the cans of paint and one of the full epoxy containers to hold them in place while the epoxy cured. There were a lot of long fillets, which meant I had to make a lot of compound. It was also a challenge to get a proper fillet on the back floorboard. This is because the angle between the floorboard and the floor of the boat were very close together. There was essentially a bump up from the thickness of the pieces of plywood that made up the floorboard. This made it very challenging to get the fiberglass tape to sit right. This is because of the 90-degree angle between the top of the fillet and the flat top of the floorboard. I started by taping the front floorboard and then moved on to the back. All of the tape is 6 inches. I was running low on the smaller sizes of tape, so I had to use the larger tape. It also just provides more structural rigidity. You can also see the 3 small holes, which are used for drainage. There is a little passageway underneath the floorboard for wires to be run and for water to drain out. This is where the small notch in the bottom of the middle bulkhead comes in handy, providing a way for the water to run to the back of the boat and to be drained. I used a router to cut the circular holes in the rear seat. These are for hatches to be installed in that allow for access into the watertight compartments. I had nailed the board that had the router on it to the center of the circle and spun it around. I put my GoPro right next to the router so that you all could see the cutting in action. In hindsight, I should have locked the bearing in place. However, I was not cutting against anything, so it didn't hurt the project. The router was mounted on a board that was spinning as opposed to running along a jig. This was a very easy way to cut out an almost perfect circle. I did this process for both holes in the back seat and for the one in the front seat, but only recorded this one. Sorry for all the twists and turns, but I guess you could say we've come full circle. I also had a sacrificial board underneath to stop the seat from splitting out and to cut into if I went too deep. Next, I cut out the sponsons and center console parts from a piece of plywood that already had one of the bottom pieces of the boat cut out of it. I had to be very careful when making and cutting because these pieces were laid out so close together. There are several rectangular pieces which make up the center console, and the triangle pieces are for the sponsons. Throughout the course of the project, I was really putting this little circular saw to work. The side pieces of the center console are from 1/2 inch plywood and had a more intricate shape to be cut out. I used a circular saw for the large cuts and a bandsaw to get the curves. All of the center console was attached with Gorilla Glue and a nail gun. I had one of my friends help me by holding the side pieces in place, and I would not have been able to construct the center console without him. I went back and epoxied and filleted the whole thing for extra strength later. There were 2 side pieces and 1 top piece to hold the whole thing together. It also slides under the bottom of the middle seat, which adds strength. I had to cover both the front and rear seats with epoxy before installing them because I could not reach the undersides afterwards. As you can see, there are 3 circular holes which correspond to the watertight compartments under these seats. The first layer of epoxy always soaked into the wood, and I had to make sure to put extra down. I also covered the entire center console in epoxy, save the bottom inch, so I could still pick it up after I was done. I went back and put a second coat on the bottom of the forward seat and started to coat the inside of the sponson panels as they would be installed later and become inaccessible. Once the epoxy was coated on the bottom of the front seat, I attached it to the boat with the fillet compound. It felt good to finally see the boat taking shape in its final form. The seat fit pretty well with some small gaps between it and the sides of my boat. The small gaps were filled in with the fillet compound for strength and waterproofing, closing the gap with the strength of the compound. This stuff turns rock hard. The front of the seat rested snug in the front of the boat, and surprisingly, I did not have to use anything to hold it in place. I used the extra filleting compound from installing the seat to start filleting the center console, which had to be installed before the middle seat. The rear seat did not quite fit correctly. which meant there was a lot of space to be filled with the fillet compound. I put tape on the undersides of the seat to catch the drips and to hold the fillet compound in the space between the seat and the boat while it cured. I made sure to put a thick bead so that the seat was well attached. And then I had to go back and smooth it out to make it look pretty. I had one of my friends help me as well. I used any extra compound to start filleting the center console in place. The boat was also rocking back and forth, which upset the GoPro, and I apologize. I made another batch of epoxy and added the wood flour and silica to continue filleting the center console. All of the joints between the wood panels are filleted inside and out. I did not want the center console falling apart or off the boat, so I made sure to do a good job. After sanding, the next thing to do was to tape both of the seats. I had saved some of the thinner fiberglass tape specifically for these joints. Before I started epoxying, I always cut the tape to length. It was just one less thing for me to do once I mixed up the epoxy and was on a timer before it cured. There were 2 pieces of tape on the front seat and 4 on the back. If you look closely, you can actually see the scarf joint seam in this video. Also looking closely, you can see that the center console has a notch in the far side. This is for the steering cable to run out and around back to the motor, but underneath the center seat. I used any extra epoxy to cover the tops of the seat and to start on the middle seat. I almost wish I had gotten a clear sealer to protect the epoxy from the UV. The grain of this boat looks so cool and it would have been nice to preserve it. As you can see, the middle seat has a very curvy shape, which is why it was so hard to cut out. Next, I fiberglassed the entire center console, every single one of the joints except for the ones on the inside on the top. This was for added strength and rigidity. If a large wave comes at my boat, I want to be able to grab the center console and not have it go anywhere. Painting the entire boat was important because epoxy deteriorates over time in UV light, which is what I mean by saying the epoxy is not UV stable. If I'd chosen to leave the wood grain, I would have had to be more careful with my writing. You can see several sharp remarks, which was how I identified the pieces and kept my sanity. I also did my best to make sure every single one of the seats got 2 coats of epoxy front and back. Finally, it was on to installing the middle seat. This seat sits on the middle bulkhead and rests on the center console. I followed the same procedure as I had done before with filleting and then fiberglass taping. I forgot to cover the bottom with epoxy before installing, and I learned why that was a bad lesson when I had to paint the epoxy on upside down. Trust me, not a fun experience. This seat really completes the boat on the inside and joins everything together. This boat is rated for 600 pounds of weight and can comfortably hold 3 people. I really like the design, and overall, it wasn't too challenging of a build. And speaking of joining, you should join me in the next video where I will finish the boat complete with paint and everything.